Now, let's get started with part 2. We briefly need to cover aperture and crop factor before we can move on to describing the different focal length. Let's start with aperture. Aperture is a way to control how much light enters the camera. There are 2 ways to control this: shutter speed and aperture. The aperture works like a cup. The shutter speed works like a faucet. The larger the cup, the more light you can gather. The slower the shutter speed, the more light flows into your cup. The faster your shutter speed, the less water flows into your cup. This may seem strange, but the larger the number, the smaller the aperture. For example, f8 is considered small, while f1.4 is considered very large. You want the lens with the widest maximum aperture you can get. Secondly, while shooting action, you need to use fast shutter speeds, or you will get motion blur, resulting in no usable images. Thirdly, it allows you to keep your ISO low. What is ISO? 3 things determine your exposure. Your exposure is how bright or how dark the image is. If it's too bright out, you can stop down the aperture or leave the aperture wide open and increase the shutter speed. But what do you do when it's dark out? You can't open your aperture any wider, and your subject is moving, so you can't use a slower shutter speed. So what do? You increase your ISO. What does that do? Well, it increases the sensitivity of the image plane. Well, the problem is, when you push your ISO too high, you get noise. This is this round, grainy texture you see in the image. You also get color noise, which is found on digital image sensors. If you're shooting on film, you won't get this problem. However, the higher the ISO of the film you use, the noisier your image will still be. This is why you want a lens with a wide maximum aperture so you can keep your ISO low. Stopping down the lens doesn't only decrease the amount of light getting to the imaging plane. It also increases image quality by allowing the light beams to be more properly bent so they can focus better on the imaging plane. However, if you stop a lens down too much, you can actually decrease image quality because the light beams are no longer properly being bent. Better built lenses don't need to be stopped down to improve their image quality. Also, better built lenses can stay sharper the further they are stopped down as well. This is a really handy feature for group photos and product photos. Let's take a look at this other example. This is my 50mm open wide at f1.2. If you notice, the center image quality is good, while the corner image quality is bad. As I stop the lens down, the image quality improves. This phenomenon is the same thing that causes the other lens aberrations, light beams not properly being bent to a point. In this case, it causes the image not to be sharp corner to corner. Do not feel like you need an optically perfect lens. Many photographers and filmmakers find fun and creative ways to use these to make very interesting images. I'll show you some examples at the end of this video. Now, for the final thing we must discuss before we can move on to talking about the different focal lengths: crop factor and aspect ratio. For simplicity's sake, we will be discussing full-frame lenses going forward in this video. But don't worry, a wide-angle lens looks like a wide-angle lens, and a telephoto lens looks like a telephoto lens on all sensor sizes. This video covers the most popular sensor sizes: medium format, full frame, APS-C, and micro four thirds. We will not be talking about medium format in this video, since it is typically used for very high-end fashion photography and very high-end product photography, and it has the largest imaging plane amongst the options. The most common aspect ratios include 4:3, 3:2, and 16:9. Full frame in APS-C has a 3:4 aspect ratio, while micro four thirds uses a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is also used by smartphones. A other aspect ratio to cover quickly is a square aspect ratio. Square images have a 1:1 aspect ratio. When buying a camera lens, it's 35mm equivalent due to differing angles of view for different camera sensors. To determine it, figure out the format and apply the crop factor. The crop factor for APS-C is 1.5, and for Micro Four Thirds, 2.0x. It is applied to the aperture and focal length. The amount of light entering the camera is not affected by crop factor. The same amount of light is entering your camera. Your crop factor only refers to how much background blur you could potentially get. The other complicating factor with light transmission is the optical lens design. This is why cinema lenses use T-stop, because they take into account the optical design of the lens and how well it can transmit light to the imaging plane, as well as the aperture opening. Keep in mind that smaller size image sensors will struggle in low light, so it's best to get a lens with a wider maximum aperture. Adding more light to the scene is also an option. Full-frame lenses are designed to cover a full-frame sensor evenly, while APS-C lenses are designed to project onto an APS-C size sensor. You can't use an APS-C lens on a full-frame camera, but you can use a full-frame lens on an APS-C camera or a smaller sensor camera. However, you're not using the camera or lens to its maximum potential due to all that light not being properly projected onto the imaging plane. The takeaway from this is that your aperture in this case only refers to the amount of background blur you can get. Get ready for part 3.